Anyway, welcome to the Made in Turkey podcast. My name's John, and today I'm talking to Tuba Tanieri Edemir. And Tuba is a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh and a coordinator for the Anti-Defamation League's task force on Middle Eastern minorities. So welcome, Tuba, and thank you for joining me. It's an interesting period of flux that we find ourselves in after the US election, and the consequences that might have for the foreign policy of Turkey and its relationship with the United States. So
Thank you for inviting me.
I don't know if you'd like to. You were telling me a bit about what your job involves, and maybe that might be some helpful context for people who are listening to this.
My work is on religious cultural heritage, and I specifically work on religious sites that have been contested, converted over, that have a long history of conflict and violence. So this is what I do, and I try to work in a way that we develop long-term sustainable management plans for these sites. That would also be important in peace building and reconciliation.
So I suppose that you might have found that a bit difficult recently in the Turkish context with the domestic kind of pressure that the government is putting on certain heritage and religious sites, and especially obviously the Hagia Sophia and other churches that were museums and have been converted into mosques like Chora.
In fact, I had already been working on Hagia Sophia for almost 2 decades now, following the developments, because it's such a symbolically important and politically central site for different purposes. And the recent developments are, of course, very critical, both in the way that they have been framed by the government, but also the fact that they have happened. So this has been a very depressing time in terms of my research, but I think very crucial one to have a very keen eye on the developments as they happen.
And in this discussion about the status of the Hagia Sophia and other churches, do you think that this discussion is how do you see the point at which this discussion is at the moment? Because obviously the conversion to a mosque has happened, but that doesn't mean that the discussion is over. I wonder how you see that discussion progressing from this point.
In my research, I had already been looking at the developments within the last 10 years, not only at Hagia Sophia, but in the larger heritage framework within Turkey. So the Turkish heritage regime has 2 government institutions that takes care of ancient and historic monuments. One of them is the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and the other one is the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. Both of these institutions have their own priorities, own legal reasoning, and own visions for the future protection of heritage sites. And even though they both overlap in certain places, their priorities and the differences in priorities is critical to understand. So in 2011, the AKP government, the Justice and Development government, decided to convert the Hagia Sophia of Nicaea, Iznik. And the conversion, the legal reasoning behind the conversion was the fact that this Byzantine church, which had been converted into a mosque during the Ottoman times and served as a museum after the 1960s under the Turkish Republic, was actually illegally occupying the sites, which should have belonged to the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. So the General Directorate of Pious Foundations brought a law case to the courts as a plaintiff, demanding from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism to return the site to the General Directorate of Pious Foundations, which happened in 2011, and shortly after the site opened as a functioning mosque. The same process, almost in an identical way, happened in 2013 with the conversion of the Hagia Sophia of Trabzon. which is again a Byzantine church converted into a mosque in the Ottoman times, served as a museum during the Turkish Republic, and was reclaimed by the General Directorate of Pious Foundations as a functioning mosque in 2013. In addition to these two kind of high-level cases, we had already been seeing similar developments elsewhere in the heritage scale. That a lot of what you would be calling remnants of ancient buildings, which may or may not have been mosques, were being considered as mosques and being built and restored as functioning mosques by the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. So this process had been ongoing already. And obviously, Hagia Sophia, you can say, is the most high-level culmination of this trajectory that had already been ongoing for the last 10 years. But at the same time, it expands beyond the Hagia Sophia. And of course, there is the case of the Hora Monastery, the Karye Museum, which, in a similar way to Hagia Sophia, had a law case indicating that it will be given to the General Directorate of Pious Foundations, and we were told in press that it would open as a functioning mosque in October the 30th. It has been postponed, but this process is ongoing. But let me also draw your attention to other cases. For instance, the Bomonti Beer Factory and Heybeli Ada Sanatorium, which you would consider to be completely secular sites, have also been taken over by the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. And the parts of Bomonti beer factory has already been destroyed in the process of making a parking lot, a cultural center, and a mosque. And a similar process is likely to take place in the case of Heybeli Ada Sanatorium. So on the one hand, Hagia Sophia's conversion is a very big political statement, but from also at the same time, from a heritage perspective, it is part of a much larger change in the heritage framework of the Turkish Republic.
I've been trying to do a project. I used to work for the charity that promotes Wikipedia, and one of the projects that the Wikipedia charities run every year is called Wikiloves Monuments, where they try to encourage people in different countries to go and take photos of heritage sites and listed buildings and things like that, so that Wikipedia can have a photographic record of those things, because Wikipedia can only use Creative Commons licensed images, so it relies on its community of editors and photographers to go out and take those images. And for a country to run a Wikiloves Monuments competition, they need to have a good list of those monuments. And in the case of Turkey, there is no there's no publicly accessible good list of heritage sites. I think that there's like this website called Evanta, which is like run by the Ministry of Culture, which has a very, very large and quite unsorted list of lots of different sites, very granular down to Ottoman fountains, but none of them have GPS coordinates. You can't really make data out of it. And also, for some reason, the website is only accessible if you have a Turkish IP address. So I was only able to access it by using a VPN to put my IP address to Turkey, which is just strange. But there's a real, there seem to be all of these obstacles to kind of recording heritage sites properly. I mean, I noticed when I was living in Istanbul five or so years ago, you go to some of these, UNESCO World Heritage sites, like the Ottoman, the Byzantine buildings around Ayvansaray and places like that, and you have this, this place is a UNESCO World Heritage site, but the signs are fading and they don't look like anything's happened to them for years, and it looks, like some of this stuff is done for show. That they're not really interested in really protecting stuff as much as they're interested in creating some kind of symbolic, kind of using it especially for touristic purposes. Like, when you think about places like Göreme National Park and places like that, the overdevelopment of those places, because of tourism, is actually really harming that heritage site. And so I just I sometimes I get the feeling like there's no long-term planning there. I mean, you can say that about development in Turkey generally. Like, if you're in Istanbul, you can see how there's no real long-term city planning there. But I mean, this kind of answers itself in a way. But you just kind of wish that there was some long-term strategy from the Turkish government where the idea was to protect this stuff long term, so it would be sustainable, as a sustainable tourist attraction, rather than just trying to like put like a concrete ring around Göbekli Tepe so that tourists can get in there. You see that stuff happening and you're like, no, don't fill it with concrete, like, what are you doing? But yeah, I mean, I could talk about this kind of heritage stuff all the time, because I really, I think that from my point of view, this is, like I said to you, this is one of the things that makes Turkey such a wonderful place to visit, is that all of those heritage sites, and that there's such a rich history of so many civilizations there. And like, sometimes they get it right. Like, I don't want to just criticize the Turkish government and say it's all bad. Like, I went to the Adana Archaeological Museum a year and a half ago, and that's a brand new museum where they've got lots of really amazing stuff there. But there was nobody there when I went there. Like, it was like a huge new museum, and like there's just not a lot of people to see that stuff. So
Yeah, let me actually kind of agree with you on certain points, that there is actually great know-how within Turkey. We have amazing people working on heritage, amazing archaeologists, amazing art historians. So the know-how is already there. It's just the overall planning that lacks a clear vision for long-term sustainability. And this is not just only, this doesn't only go for the symbolic important heritage sites, but it kind of can cover, it's a problem that has been ongoing within Turkey for a while, even with the very well trained personnel that we have.
um, to move slightly to minority rights more generally, one of the things that I saw recently that I thought was interesting was the response of the AKP to the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit. Pompeo's going on a 7-country, I guess, lame duck tour of various places that I don't know, Trump wants to kind of like symbolically appeal to, I suppose, in his last few months. And Pompeo is going to visit the Orthodox Patriarch of Istanbul, I think. And the response of the AKP spokesperson was to say, in many parts of the world, religious minorities, especially Muslims, have to perform their worship under unfavorable conditions and under threat, while our non-Muslim citizens can freely understand their religious obligations in our country, and the freedom of worship of our citizens belonging to different faiths is protected. I wonder if you could give an assessment of that rosy picture of minority rights, and whether it's a fair assessment or not.
So the answer to your question is both a yes and a no. And yes, there is truth to it, that a lot of Turkey's minorities are in a much better position than elsewhere in the world. Think about the Uyghur Muslims in China, and many others across the world. So there is that. But at the same time, what we have been seeing in terms of Turkish government's attitude, but in particular President Erdogan's attitude towards the minorities, is very parallel to an Ottoman understanding of the Sultanate versus its minorities, the millet system, that the government and the head of the government sees itself as the person to grant rights to minorities. So if you are a minority community, a non-Muslim community, as long as you behave within the boundaries that are drawn for you by the government, you are pretty much okay. But whenever you want to do something outside, then you hit quite significant obstacles. Let me kind of give you a couple of examples. For instance, of the Christian minority populations, you cannot go and proselytize. So you cannot go and talk others to come into your faith. So there is like this very strict border. And for Turkey's ancient communities, such as the Armenian community and the Greek Orthodox community, this may not be one of the most critical issues. Although I have to say that, people who want to reclaim their Armenian identity, the third generation survivors of the Armenian Genocide, for instance, are also having a very hard time being baptized into the Armenian Church because of those kind of invisible boundaries around. But one of the communities, if you think about the Protestant community in Turkey that actually wants to proselytize, that wants to talk about its faith, they have been very critically stopped. So there is strong control in terms of this. Let me also give you another example. I think in 2009 or 2010, Erdogan was giving a speech at the European Commission. And within that speech, they asked him about, the rights of Christians in Turkey. And his answer was practically this. He said, we restored the Armenian church in Van. We restored Sümele Monastery. What else do you want? It was, and this is kind of very significant in the way he thinks about this, and a lot of the Turkish government officials think about this too. Any archaeological, historical heritage within the boundaries of Turkey, within the legal heritage system of Turkey, is the responsibility of the government to take place. We have a blanket protection. It's within our law. So it is not a good grace, or it's not a favor to restore an ancient monument within your territory. It's your responsibility. It is something that you have to do, and to be, honest, very little done up to that point. So this kind of highlights the distinction, how the government positions itself vis-a-vis religious minorities. We have also seen that in the case of Hagia Sophia's conversion too. The conversion was not only from a museum to a mosque, but it was framed in around the rhetoric and discourse of conquest. And this was very strongly present in President Erdogan's speech. Ali Erbaş's giving this Friday sermon with a sword at hand, and it kind of permeated into the rest of the society as well. The whole transition marked marked a difference between being a member of the conquerors versus being a member of the conquered populations. So this idea of conquest not only created a feeling of inequality within the citizens, but also has potential to incite supremacist and extremist discourses that the minorities are more and more subjected to in terms of hate speech and hate crimes.
I wonder if Westerners should perhaps not be so surprised at the kind of return of some of these, or maybe not the return of some of these kind of Ottoman ways of seeing minority communities within Turkey. I mean, obviously, there's this kind of resurgence or renaissance of Ottomanism within the parts of the Turkish ruling class at the moment, and I don't know. I wonder whether that's just a phase, or whether that's something that never really went away, and Westerners perhaps were kidding themselves that Turkey had fundamentally become more westernized in its attitude towards secularism.
I would argue this is kind of like a more pronounced development over the last 2 decades, as opposed to much, for most of Turkish Republic, that this strong neo-Ottomanism is present in different parts, including pop culture, its attitudes towards minorities, attitudes towards Turkey's expansionist policies. So it's a whole set of things that became a lot more pronounced over the last 2 decades. And I think 2020, especially with Turkey's adventures outside its borders and symbolic acts like the conversion of Hagia Sophia, have kind of shown that it is a very strong trend, and it needs to not be it needs to be taken serious. And it's one can laugh all we want at the TV dramas about the Ottoman Empire, the cosplay parts of it in pop culture, but this is a very significant social and political trend that is ongoing, and I would argue it essentially does a lot of harm in terms of social cohesion, pluralism, and the idea of coexistence with different communities within Turkey.
So I guess I was looking at the minority rights website, minority rights group website. I did an internship for them about 10 years ago, and their sort of assessment of Turkey's current situation was that Turkey continues to accept only three non-Muslim groups as minorities: Armenians, Rum Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and Jews. And that's been the case, since basically the Republic era, the start of the Republic era. And I wonder, if you could give an understanding of how that affects other groups who are, both non-Muslim minorities like Assyrians and Chaldeans, and also perhaps, how does that leave groups like Alevis, who are still considered to be Muslims, but also at the same time not considered to be quite the same as the Sunni Muslim majority group.
So there are very strong and ongoing ingrained inequality and discrimination towards different communities within Turkey. And you're right, the three minority communities that are recognized by the Lausanne Treaty have a specific, legal protection within Turkey. This does not necessarily mean that, they have a privileged situation, but at least they are protected with the Lausanne Treaty. So other minorities might have a much harder time. Alevis and their faith institutions and faith leaders have had a very long ongoing problem with the government in terms of having their places of worship recognized as such. And many other groups, Syriacs, Chaldeans, and so on and so forth, have a very hard time even claiming the, religious heritage they are already occupying from, that they are already owners of. So these are some of the issues that are ongoing. One big problem that affects all religious minorities, including the ones that are protected by Lausanne Treaty, is the lack of legal recognition. And that puts a lot of obstacles in the way that the minorities can defend their rights within the Turkish legal system. So they have been asking for that for a very long time. And in terms of again, going back to my earlier remark, the current framework is one of toleration, that the minorities are allowed to exist in Turkey. We need to change that back to the idea of equal citizenship, that nobody in Turkey should be tolerated. Everybody should be an equal citizen, no matter what you believe in, or which ethnic group you belong to, and that with that we have a lot of a lot of work to do still. And finally, impunity of hate crimes is a very important legal factor. This goes both for attacks on people, but also attacks on places of worship. And in many cases, the government or the legal system just gives a slap on the back of the hand and lets the attacker go. This has to stop to make sure that such attacks don't happen in the future.
You said it should go back to a kind of a legal equality, but I wonder whether maybe part of the problem is that under the secular republic period that that these things ever really instituted legally? I mean, the kind of Turkification process, it to me it doesn't seem like some of these things that some of the more secular people in Turkey want. They have this idea that things were maybe better 40 years ago, but I wonder if maybe that's nostalgia. And actually, like the Republic was not very. It was definitely not very progressive, especially towards the Kurdish minority.
Again, the answer to this question is a yes and no too. I mean, we can argue that things were different 2 decades ago in certain ways, but still, some of these ingrained inequalities have their roots going back throughout the Turkish Republic. And we cannot necessarily, we should be aware of that this is not just a problem that has been, brought to us recently. That is certainly something that we need to be aware of. But at the same time, we have to see the severity of the current situation as well. So it's not an either or, but both. We need to, yes, acknowledge the past and the things that had not been done right, but also we need to grapple with the future, with the current situation, which may have its own unique political context, which is important to realize as well.
So what I wonder, what legal changes would you ideally like to see the current or any future Turkish government make, and like what would equality look like in terms of legal progress?
First, again, legal persona for religious communities is very important. A lot of the current situation, for instance, has discriminatory effects in education, in central examination systems, in minorities applying for civil servant jobs, things like these. These have to be, we have a lot of work to do in these areas. And again, Turkish meddling in the faith affairs of religious communities is a big problem as well. So those are the things that I would suggest needs to be immediately taken care of and changed in a positive way.
Do you think that the Turkish government lacks some willpower to make these kind of changes at the moment, though? I mean, I not wanting to be too negative, I can't really see that the current Turkish government has much wants to spend any political capital on doing some of these things. It seems to have quite different priorities at the moment.
You're right. I was just going to say none of these things, from where I look at the current affairs, seems to be a priority of the government at the moment. And also the government may not look favorably upon these changes, because making these changes means you have less control over the religious minorities. And that mentality is one that we need to change immediately as well.
Certainly, looking at Turkish history, there's a kind of an unfortunate, perhaps, legacy of some of the, the kind of legal changes that were made under the Tanzimat period, perhaps, where when the first constitution was promulgated in the 1870s. You could argue that led to that in a way that led to a backlash against some of the minority millets, because in providing more legal equality for Christian groups, for example, it required, I think, maybe not during the Tanzimat period, but later than that, when other minorities were also required to do military service. I mean, that kind of before, when they were exempted from that, that was a privilege that they had, and then I think a lot of the Orthodox community left after that point, where they were started to be required to do military service. So I wonder if there's a kind of historical resistance to legal equality for religious groups, perhaps because of the experience of what happened at the end of the Ottoman Empire.
I would be very cautious about making that parallel, because I can hear a Turkish government official using the exact same mentality for not granting further rights to minorities. And we are not at the end of the 19th century anymore. We're hopefully well into the 21st century. Situation across the globe in terms of equality, minority rights, religious freedoms is at a much different place, and Turkey is way behind in terms of following up with the standards set by many countries. So I mean, historians may make arguments about the 19th century, and that's fine. But we are in a different context, and we need to realize that we're in a different context. And yes, we should learn from the mistakes of the past and tragedies of the past, but that only comes with further transparency and acknowledgement of what happened wrong in the past. Then you can move forward, and that is perhaps part of the problem that we're facing. But again, we need to think of 2020, not the end of the 19th century, and the conditions that we're facing in Turkey at the moment.
Yes, I agree with you. I definitely, I worry that sometimes that people can get trapped in that, it's not just Turkish people who are sometimes trapped within a kind of worldview that's influenced by past events. I think a lot of British people as well are kind of trapped within a sort of post-imperial hangover mindset, where they believe that Britain is a lot greater than it actually is, and therefore can detach itself from the European Union and sail away into the sunset like a great empire. And I worry that kind of mentality is going to come back to bite Britain in the arse at some point, quite soon, probably.
So that's going to be the edited out part?
No. I can trash my own country as much as I want. That's, it's my British privilege to trash my own country.
No, but that's precisely why historical transparency is so important. And, facing the tragedies of the past is so important, and learning and educating people in Turkey and outside Turkey about those as well. And, that, I think, is the only way to build peace and coexistence and pluralism in Turkey for the future. So I agree with you with the fact that with further knowledge and transparency of the past is good for us.
That's why I'm a huge supporter of the Turkish Wikipedia community. I think that what they do is fantastic, because there's still some dodgy stuff that's written by nationalists and other people with particular agendas on there, but I think in general you're probably going to get a slightly more neutral idea of history from the Turkish Wikipedia than you might do by going to a Turkish museum or reading a government certified history book, perhaps.
But then again, there are a lot of scholars over the last 2 decades or so, not all of them Turkish, they don't need to be, that have been focusing on rather painful periods of Turkish past, which is, I think, a very important development in terms of how we start rethinking about the past too.
Yeah, I think
houses like Agos and things like these, minority newspapers publishing things, Shalom, Agos, outlets such as these are very important to have the voices out and some of the different perspectives that maybe a normal Turkish kid does not necessarily read in terms of their school curricula, but can have access to information with the research published elsewhere. Not, unfortunately, in the Turkish government-sponsored media at all. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, media pluralism in Turkey is a huge part of this conversation, and it again is not in a particularly good state at the moment. And the law, the recent internet law about companies having to have a legal representative is potentially potentially damaging also to people's access to different kinds of media. Although having said that, I would definitely not encourage anybody to get their news from Facebook at all. But at least Wikipedia was unblocked at the beginning of this year, so that was good. I wonder, perhaps lastly, like I said, I have a huge love for some of the heritage sites that exist in Turkey. I hope when I have a good 6 months free, I'd like to do a kind of William Dalrymple kind of thing of just traveling around to various heritage sites and maybe writing something about it.
Favorite authors, so by the way, thank you.
So there's so many places that I would love to see in Turkey, and I wonder if you have any particular favorite places that are perhaps under threat from something that you would like to see the Turkish government do more to take care of.
That is a great question. And it's a very hard one because I cannot prioritize of one site over another.
Oh, come on, top five. It's arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary.
Yeah, I worked in Eastern Turkey, so I have great love for a lot of the heritage in Eastern Turkey, and one should definitely visit. And Eastern Black Sea region is one of my favorites. Although, over the last decade, a lot has been destroyed in Eastern Black Sea in terms of, development projects. There is still a lot to go and see. So I have to do that. Do you want to ask me about why Turkey is not necessarily protecting heritage as well as it should?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's do that as our. I mean, it's a very general question, obviously, but if you think that there's any overarching kind of reasons why that happens.
This again goes back to traumatic parts of Turkish history, partially. There is a great and unfortunate tradition of treasure hunting in Turkey. And it is kind of like a very common pastime. People have groups, they share maps and things. And there is a very tragic root to this tradition. Think about Turkey and in the early 20th century. First, 1915, Armenian Genocide. You have a great portion of the Armenian population wiped out from the geography, leaving, of course, their sacred sites, their houses, everything, their schools, everything behind. And of course, we have the compulsory population exchange between Turkey and Greece in 1923, which resulted in the Greek Orthodox population of Turkey being taken away from Turkey to be replaced in Greece, and the Muslim population from Greece coming to Turkey in a very similar, parallel, identical way. And again, with these two major events, you have an essential de-Christianization of Anatolia as we know. So you have a massive amounts of churches, cemeteries, Christian monuments across the country that did not have their constituencies anymore. So they were left in a state that nobody really cared for them. And a lot of these treasure hunting stories start with destroying ancient sites of Christian heritage. They don't stop there. There's a lot more going on in all sorts of contexts. But a lot of them, if I can't stomach it, but I know of my wonderful colleagues who follow these groups for research purposes and to keep an eye on what's going on. A lot of these maps that treasure hunters talk about have crosses on them, so you have to go to this place that has a cross and excavate behind it. That cross is usually part of a monastery, monastic complex or something like that. So that treasure hunting mentality, I think, may have provided the background for how in Turkey a lot of people are very careless about monuments, that they are not seen as part of a rich, wonderful past, but they're seen as resources for personal gain. And that mentality does a lot of harm to religious heritage. And one more thing, when I was a graduate student, I was taking a class on Byzantine Constantinople, and our wonderful professor took us for a trip to walking around Istanbul looking at Byzantine monuments. And one of the underground cisterns was being restored at that moment, and we went in, and there were significant problems with the restoration, and me being in my 20s and a lot more critical, I just went to the person who was in charge, and I was like telling him, why are you doing this and not this, and so on and so forth. And he said, and that sentence stuck with me to this day, he said, it's very hard to stop in front of money in Istanbul. So on the one hand, you have this subconscious of treasure hunting, and on the other hand, you have these development projects that prioritize the current moment and monetary gain from the current moment over the idea of heritage. So both of these trends combined creates a very problematic context for any one of us who want to preserve cultural heritage in Turkey.
I wonder if you saw there was a recent music video by Mabel Matiz, the singer who he did his music video in the famous abandoned Greek town near to Fethiye.
Yes, I didn't see the video, but I know.
I'll send it to you. It's I wonder if that kind of cultural product where the space itself is being kind of celebrated and reused in a positive way is some small way to kind of elevate that built environment above its above it just being seen as a resource. I certainly hope that kind of thing we'll see more of that kind of thing.
I haven't watched the video, but I mean, we have the traditional education resources, and pop culture actually plays into this. So again, that music video may have been a good example. I wish somebody would do something like that with Cappadocia, for instance. And, think about it. It's a beautiful geography. You have beautiful churches, very little curated. You understand very little about the presence of Christianity in that region, other than the aesthetic value of the things that you see. And that is actually kind of like a source of hurt for the descendants of these communities too. And in a lot of our post-colonial heritage discourses, we discussed about the indigenous rights to heritage. And one of the things that when we wrote an article with my dear friend and colleague Eli Berna Urs on the conversion of Hora and Hagia Sophia. And we, in that article, we were thinking about the rights of heritage of the Greek Orthodox communities for Hora and Hagia Sophia. If you think about it, they're the indigenous populations that built those monuments. They're the indigenous, I mean, the people whose grandparents are from the Cappadocia region are the, descendants of that indigenous group who made these things. But they don't have any connection that they can show to the world with those monuments. So this is kind of like something that we need to remedy as well. And such cultural productions could be a positive influence in terms of telling that history of those places too.
I don't know if you saw that other short video that I think I sent to you that I made when I was in Istanbul about the architecture. Yeah. And obviously recently the Orthodox
Prinkipo orphanage,
yeah, that there's been some collapse there, and but now I think I saw maybe Daily Sabah, one of these government newspapers, saying that there's going to be some restoration work taking place, but it sounded like it was the responsibility of the Orthodox Patriarchate, which I don't really think they have the money to do that. I mean, I think they were saying that they couldn't really afford to do the necessary works. So obviously it needs some government assistance as well.
So the case of the Prinkipo orphanage is actually a very interesting and a very tragic one, that it was part of the Greek Orthodox community, as it was when it was serving as an orphanage, but it was taken from them in the 1960s because of political reasons. Turkey and Northern Cyprus conflict that had a second wave impact for the Turkish citizens of Greek Orthodox faith living in Turkey. And it was not given back to the Patriarchate for, I think they gave it back in 2010. So 50 years. Now, think about this. This is a wooden structure. Wooden structures, it's a magnificent one, 5 stories, very rare in terms of its architectural qualities. It's actually a very, very important endangered monument, and it's recognized as such. But they need almost daily maintenance. They're wonderful, but if you leave them even for a few years, they suffer damage. And then the Turkish authorities, after a very lengthy legal battle, they give it back to the Patriarchate. Wonderful. But then it's the Patriarchate's duty to undo the damage of 50 years down to that building. And it's a very costly restoration project. It needs to be done with people with amazing skill and expertise, and it needs to be done really well. So recently, about a month ago, a part of the roof collapsed, bringing the issue back into discussion. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not necessarily the government that took on the restoration project, but Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality that offered help to the Patriarchate in terms of digitally recording and working on a restoration plan with them for whatever function the Patriarchate decides to use it for. And I think this is exactly the type of collaboration that will result in a positive way for everyone involved. So I am looking forward to that development. On the one hand, again, we have to think of the injustice done to the building and also to the Patriarchate, to the Greek Orthodox community, that they have to pay for that 50 years worth of damage. But at the same time, the local municipal government taking over that monument says a lot about the kind of possibility of change for the future if done with the right incentive. So I take it as a very, positive development.
Yeah, I hope that I think that if there was some initiative from either local government or the national government in Turkey, I think that they would find that there's a lot of people who would be willing to collaborate on, trying to protect and restore a lot of these places. I wish that I could get the Ministry of Culture to release a really good open data list of all of the heritage sites, so that Wikipedia and the Wikimedia community in Turkey could do some digital recording of the history of these places, because without the data being publicly available, it's really difficult to start to do that work. But yeah, if there's anybody from the Ministry of Culture who listens to my podcast, then please release the data. I'd love to work on it. I don't think that I don't think they listen to my podcast, so but, who knows? Maybe one day. Well, thank you very much for talking to me. It's 10 o'clock here in Milan, so I'm gonna have a drink, and I'm very tired. I've been working all week.
Thank you so much for the invitation, but yeah, likewise. It's getting to the Friday afternoon time here too.
Well, I wish you a very lovely weekend, and hopefully we can talk again at some point when there's some good news about some heritage being protected.
Any news on heritage, please?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I'll see you sometime soon. And bye-bye.
Bye.